Vere Gordon Childe was born in Australia shortly before 1900. He studied archaeology in Australia and then in England. He's most well known for his years at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where he conducted important excavations of ancient Neolithic communities. His Marxist orientation helps to explain why he saw human prehistory as a series of revolutions, as can be seen in the title of his article here. This article is important because it suggests that there is a typical sequence of progression through the stages of social organization he describes, culminating in urban civilization. This kind of search for a predictable pattern in the diversity of human experience is at the heart of all the social sciences. The article has been widely cited and has exercised a formative influence on the work of many scholars since it was published at the middle of the 20th century. This also may be where Indiana Jones got the hat. V. Gordon Childe's article in the Town Planning Review was first published exactly in the middle of the 20th century. He wrote The Urban Revolution to explain where cities came from and why they have appeared in recent human history. His perspective has several key features. First, Childe claims that the past can be divided into ages, and that these ages represent millennia during which people lived in ways that hardly seem to change at all over vast reaches of time. Beneath the surface, however, Childe insists that each age was building up to a climax that would result in a sudden transformation into the next age. He even called these transformations revolutions, which explains the title of the article. During the first two of the three ages he describes, there were no true cities anywhere on Earth. They only appear in the third and final age. That is why he calls the transformation that begins this third age the urban revolution. Childe uses the old-fashioned term savagery to describe people who lived for scores of thousands of years without any written history and even without any settled residence. He explains that during the age of savagery, people lived off the land in small bands, probably organized as large extended families, hunting animals, catching fish, and gathering wild fruits, berries, roots, and other edible plants. He doesn't say much about why these hunters and gatherers kept the same way of life for all those millennia, and he also doesn't say much about why they suddenly experienced a revolution that he calls Neolithic, referring to the New Stone Age, the revolution that ushered in the next stage of human progress. To solve that mystery, you'll need a different course. He says a little more about the Neolithic period itself. The second age is important for Childe because it marks the beginning of people settling down in small communities that remain fixed in one place. The revolutionary change that he thinks made this new way of life possible involved food. For the savages, or hunters and gatherers, every day posed the same challenge over and over again for a lifetime. Where will we find our food today? In the New Stone Age, a new answer appeared. People domesticated plants and animals, creating a captive food supply. If anyone asked, where will we find our food today? The answer was just to point out the window at the garden or at the animals in their pens. Neolithic people invented pottery and irrigation and gave us such a heritage of cows, horses, pigs, sheep, goats, dogs, cats, chickens, wheat, corn, rice, barley, cotton, and other carefully domesticated and improved plants and animals that it is difficult to stop and think of an animal or a plant that has been added to this list since the clever Stone Age villagers developed them. But the hallmark of this age of Neolithic villages, which Childe links to the older term barbarians, was that life was still all about food. Instead of hunting for food, people grew domesticated plants and animals under their control. But still, Childe insists, every person in such a village was still involved in producing this food supply, even if they had other skills. This common way of life gave everyone a similar sense of what goals were worthwhile, what kinds of behavior were useful or harmful, a strong sense of a traditional way of life as a valuable shared cultural invention to be treasured and protected. This kind of community solidarity in the Neolithic village was reinforced by kinship as an organizing principle for families. Beyond the solidarity of kinship groups and a shared round of life, says Childe, these villages knew no other important forms of social organization, hierarchy, or control. He does drop one or two hints about how this second or barbarian age of Neolithic villages gradually built up to his urban revolution, though. On his page 6, Childe remarks that, quote, as soon as the population of a settlement rose above the numbers that could be supported from the accessible land, the excess had to hive off and found a new settlement, unquote. So we see that he assumes that there has always been a potential pressure of population on resources, even in human prehistory. We get a picture of these Neolithic villages gradually multiplying over the landscape until eventually they cover all the available good land after a few centuries or perhaps thousands of years. Even when the countryside is blanketed with Neolithic villages, everybody is still directly involved with growing food. People are sedentary, and there are many more of them than could have lived on the same land as savages hunting and gathering, but there are still no cities. Childe follows up on his hint about population growth immediately with a second revelation about what might bring his second age of barbarism to its final climax. The secret is to be found in the new productivity of people, with all their new tools and plants and animals and village houses. Again, on his page 6, Childe says, quote, the new economy allowed the farmer to produce every year more food than was needed to keep him and his family alive, unquote. Owing to the low efficiency of Neolithic techniques, the surplus produced was insignificant at first, but it could be increased until it demanded a reorganization of society. That reorganization would be, in fact, the urban revolution of his title. After reviewing the first two ages of savagery and barbarism, Childe is ready to usher us into the age of civilization marked by that revolution. So what exactly did trigger the urban revolution? What turned some Neolithic villages into the first true cities the world had ever seen? Writing in the middle of the 20th century, Childe chose one theory that was popular at that time, called the hydraulic theory of civilization. It emphasizes the need for a large population of people with special skills needed to build, operate, and maintain all the inventions for moving water from place to place so that it can be used for crop irrigation, cooking and drinking, and other vital tasks. People gathered in these sites of the first great waterworks for irrigation, partly because they could produce enough food that way to support unheard of new large populations, and also because they were needed for all the labor-intensive work of keeping canals and dikes in working order. On his page 8, Childe mentions this hydraulic theory of civilization. Quote, about 5,000 years ago, irrigation cultivation in the valleys of the Nile, the Tigris-Euphrates, and the Indus had begun to yield a social surplus large enough to support a number of residential specialists who were themselves released from food production, unquote. Now, Childe recognizes that non-farmer specialists also appeared in Neolithic villages. Mostly, he believes, they were part-time craftsmen making arrowheads or pottery or other items in the time they could spare from their main job of farming or hunting. But he knows from work by other archaeologists that there were also some full-time craftsmen in Neolithic times. A Stone Age village could not support these craftsmen by itself, so they tended to move around between villages, plying their specialized trades in one community after another. Only when we get to the first true cities, however, do the craftsmen settle down into whole neighborhoods of shoemakers, metalworkers and bricklayers, weaponsmiths, musicians, merchants, scribes, or priests. After faithfully sketching out the hydraulic theory of civilization, however, Childe has to admit that cities of the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas in the New World did not arise mainly to organize and operate vast systems of irrigation. In fact, Childe points out that not all of these cities even enjoyed domesticated animals, or the plow, or the wheel. Still, they clearly were cities and not just Neolithic villages because they met Childe's most important criterion for a city. It must include the resident population of full-time specialists who do something else besides producing food. The complexity of organizing life in these much larger new communities with so many different kinds of people led to 10 key features that Childe singles out as the hallmarks of the first true cities. These are all things that you never find in Neolithic villages. They only appear once you find yourself in a city, once you're caught up in the urban revolution. One of these, actually the sixth criterion, was writing, including marks carved into tables of stone. Neolithic villages didn't need it. City dwellers did. Another criterion was trade with distant places, such as other cities. But for Childe, the most important question was how a population of full-time, non-agricultural specialists would get something to eat without producing any food of their own. Traveling or part-time specialists in Neolithic villages could barter with farmers, exchanging some pottery or a song or a pair of shoes for some food. But Childe insists that an entirely new kind of social organization appears in cities. In the new cities, he declares on his page 10, the specialists, quote, did not secure their share by directly exchanging their products or services for grain or fish with individual peasants, unquote. Instead, farmers had to turn over a significant part of their produce to the rulers of the city. These rulers emerged for the most part from two groups who had been present already in Neolithic villages, but who seized control of the tip of the much larger pyramid of people and production concentrated in a city. In the age of savagery, these two groups had been hunters, whose strength and skill with weapons secured meat and hides for the wandering band, and the shamans who knew the traditional rituals and songs to bring luck to the hunters and to keep people safe. In the settled Neolithic villages of the barbarian age, these same warriors defended the village against lions or bandits. These same medicine men blessed crops, led public rituals, and passed down the unwritten history of their community across the generations through oral traditions. Now in the city, these two groups united to operate the very first urban protection racket. The warriors, whose leader often took the title of king, claimed the right of support from the farmers because they offered protection, usually from the king and warriors of a neighboring city. The priests explained to the people why the gods wanted them to deliver as much food as possible into the central granary, whose walls were sometimes thicker than the walls around the city itself. If anyone was not convinced by the priests, the warriors made sure that the granary was filled. Once the food was locked inside, anyone who wanted to eat had to do pretty much whatever the priests and warriors told them to do, whether that was building more walls and temples and granaries, or working in the fields, or delivering fine linens and pottery to the palace, or singing and dancing to entertain the rulers. Childe describes this protection racket as concentrating the surplus, and viewed it as a crucial social innovation that made cities possible in the first place. Quote, without this concentration, owing to the low productivity of the rural economy, no effective capital would have been available, unquote. With the resources they controlled, the ruling elites ordered construction of huge monuments, such as the pyramids of Egypt or Mexico, the Colosseum in Rome, the Forbidden City in Beijing, the Tower of Babylon, and other wonders of the ancient world. Such monumentalism is listed by Childe and many other scholars as another key difference between true cities and all Neolithic villages, a way to demonstrate and further magnify the power and control of the warriors and priests. Arts and religion flourished. Scholars built up a growing body of knowledge about astronomy, seasons and climate, better agricultural tools and practices, new construction advances, and the earliest steps towards understanding medicine and disease. Only a small fraction of the people in these first cities enjoyed all the advantages generated by the urban revolution, and only a small fraction of the people in these pre-industrial societies could even manage to live in the city at all, rather than the countryside around it. Still, with the appearance of these first cities, Childe declares that a whole new age of human progress had begun, the age of cities, or to use a word from the same root as cities, civilization. His article about what he called the urban revolution draws from information about ancient cities in many parts of the world. However, the 10 features he describes for these cities fit most closely to what we might call the classical examples of the earliest known cities. These include, above all, the dense network of ancient cities including Babylon, Uruk, Kish, and many others that grew up in the rich soil of the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, the area often called the Fertile Crescent. As we already have discussed, these cities created huge, complex irrigation systems using the water from these two great rivers to feed larger and larger populations. They came to include large numbers of skilled craftsmen, merchants and traders, scribes, artists, and other non-agricultural specialists. These specialists depended on the power of the elite priests and warriors to arrange for collection of food from the great mass of the population in and around the city, who remained peasant farmers. This centrally controlled surplus of non-farmers, extra food, and other raw materials allowed the ruling elites of these ancient Mesopotamian cities to organize construction of gigantic monumental structures to further consolidate their power. Childe also mentions the Indus River Valley in what is now Pakistan as the site of similar early urban concentrations. The truly ancient ruins of Mohenjo-Daro give us a glimpse of what may be one of the very earliest cities in the world. Here again we find evidence of the irrigation projects, the full-time non-agricultural specialists, the ruling elites, and the monumentalism that Childe uses to set these early cities apart from smaller, simpler Neolithic villages. Finally, Childe also briefly mentions Egypt in his descriptions. The ancient cities of Egypt do display some interesting differences from those in Mesopotamia and in the Indus River Valley, which we will consider when we come to later readings. But here again we also find Childe's key features of the earliest true cities: complex irrigation projects, non-agricultural specialists, and a ruling elite of priests and warriors to concentrate the surplus of people and resources and direct them to monumental constructions that still can be seen in these places today.